Hi, Valley Fourth Church. Pastor Josh here, joined by Pastor Sam today. Joe was busy today, not able to join us for the filming. We want to bring you the Community Connection video today, and we're excited to talk some apologetics. Get excited for Thinking Biblically Conference, and just to let you know what's going on. So why don't you give them just the update, Sam, on the conference and the details they need to know.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard, our Thinking Biblically conference is still going to be happening this year. It's going to be May 16th and 17th. And really the change that we're making is that we're moving this conference to an online platform, much like you've seen our Sunday church services. We are still going to have our guest speaker, Nathan Betts from RZIM. Ravi Zacharias International Ministry. He's going to be giving a number of talks on some difficult topics related to apologetics, as well as some Q&A sessions. And so we're excited for how this event is coming together with some of the technology we have. Basically, the way that you'll access this is the same way that you've been accessing our Sunday sermons and Sunday services. Is you'll go to youtube.com/Valley Fourth Church, and you'll see it live there on May 16th. Or you could go to our website at valleyfourth.com and access it there as well. Now, you'll also probably start seeing some promotion for this event, particularly on Facebook. And so one way that we are asking you to help us with this event is to share those promotions, share the posts, the events that we make related to thinking biblically with your friends and family. You know, typically with events like this in our church, we've created postcards that you can kind of hand deliver to people. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that because of coronavirus, but it in many ways would be just as effective, if not more effective, for you to click like on some of those posts, maybe to share them to your own page, or even tag some of your friends that may be interested in an event like this so that they could be notified of when the event is and how they can watch it.
Wonderful. Well, back in Easter a few weeks ago, we shared with you an opportunity to watch some videos by Lee Strobel called The Case for Easter, Apologetics Related to the Resurrection. And we just thought it'd be fun right now to kind of review some of that. You know, that's been kind of one of the centuries-long apologetic questions is how could you believe in the resurrection? You know, we know from science that people don't raise from the dead. So how could you as a Christian believe in the resurrection from the dead? And it's a legitimate question to ask and to answer. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time answering that today. Lee Strobel in his books and videos gives what he calls the 4 E's to help explain that. And so the first one is the execution of Jesus. So to prepare us to think about the resurrection, you need to understand a few things about the execution of Jesus. First of all, Jesus lived. You can't deny that Jesus didn't live. And he also died. To deny that Jesus lived and died would be to deny that Abe Lincoln was assassinated. History tells us that there was a Jesus that lived then and that he was crucified by the Romans. Now, you know, people may say he was a good moral teacher or a crazy man or something else, but you can't say that he didn't exist because Jesus did exist and he did die. Now, the Romans were experts at executions. There were no botched crucifixions like you might see a botched execution in the news today. So when they killed someone, they were 100% effective. And so that's an important kind of underlying piece when we think about the resurrection, to recognize Jesus lived and died. He was executed by the Romans. We know this to be a historical fact. So that's the first E. Sam, what's the second E?
Yeah, the second E is this idea of early evidence. The resurrection of Jesus has tons of early evidence, and really some of the earliest evidence we have are the Gospels. Now, you may typically think that the Gospels are just a religious text, but in all reality, the Gospels in many places, actually throughout all academics, is treated as a historical source. And so some of the earliest evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus unquestionably is in the Gospels. And one of the places that I would point you to is 1 Corinthians 15. Paul basically recounts the fact that Jesus really died in accordance with Scripture, and that he really rose again in accordance with Scripture, and he was on the earth in his resurrection body for a period of time, up to 40 days. And in that time, he appeared to a variety of people. He appeared to Paul himself, the apostles, and up to 500 people at one time. And so we have early evidence in the gospel that testifies to the reality that Jesus really did rise again from the dead. But I recognize not many people are going to look to the gospels as maybe the prime authority on this issue like we as believers would. And so it may be helpful for you to know, and for maybe you to be able to share with those who may be a little more skeptical about Jesus' resurrection, that the gospels aren't the only historical evidence to Jesus' resurrection. In in fact, we can look to outside historians like Josephus or Tacitus or Lucian and others that all mention the fact that Jesus was really a man, he was really crucified, and that there are many claims that he has risen from the dead. And so when you take those claims, as well as the evidence in the Gospels, as well as the eyewitness evidence as well, which we'll get to a little bit later, we can see that the resurrection is not something that's just pulled out of thin air, but has some actual evidence to back it.
Yeah, that early evidence is so important because if they had started saying it, 300 years later, it'd be, a made up fable or whatever.
Yeah, but it was immediately after his crucifixion.
It was immediately. And so people that were around could have said, I was there. I saw it or didn't see it.
Exactly.
And so the fact that they were writing and talking about it so early affirms that. The third E is the empty tomb. So history also tells us that there was an empty tomb. And regardless of what you think about Jesus, you need to have an explanation for the empty tomb. Why was it empty? We as Christians believe the reason for the empty tomb is that Christ rose by the power of God. But there are many other explanations that are out there. There's even one that's recorded in, I think Matthew, I believe, tells us about the cover-up conspiracy in which the high priest spread the rumor that the disciples came and stole Jesus' body. That's probably the most common explanation. The disciples came and stole it so that they could claim he rose from the dead and then start their own religious movement. And there's a number of problems with that, of course. How could an untrained group of fishermen overpower all the Roman guards, move the stone and take Jesus? Also, if they stole the body, couldn't they eventually find it again and recover it? And why the disciples would even do that? Because we read them kind of scattered and fearful after the crucifixion.
Not to mention, the disciples really were shocked by Jesus' death in the first place, and basically weren't, in many ways, getting the message that Jesus must die and rise again throughout Jesus' life and ministry. So why would they come up with this after the fact?
Definitely. A second explanation people give for the empty tomb is called a swoon theory, or that Jesus was revived from the dead. So in this theory, they say that Jesus appeared to die on the cross, but didn't completely die. Some even suggest that what was given to him in the sponge was like a drug that made him appear that he was dead to those that were there. And then when they placed him in the tomb and he rested for a couple days, that he was able to recover. And so that's an interesting theory. Should think about it, but it doesn't take long to realize. First of all, the Romans, they would not have botched an execution. They knew the sword pierced his side, the blood and the water came out, just the fact that, how could that even happen? It's just kind of ridiculous if you think about it.
I mean, thinking about being in a tomb for multiple nights after a severe scourging and beating, experiencing the trauma of a crucifixion, being wrapped in cloth that likely would suffocate someone in good health, and being in a cold, dark tomb for 3 days and then miraculously having the strength to get up and move the stone and walk out. It's a bit far-fetched.
Yeah, definitely. And a couple more theories real quick. There's a wrong tomb theory, which says that the disciples, the women, showed up at the wrong tomb. That's why it was empty, which is kind of preposterous because they saw where he was laid. It was being guarded. And if you've ever visited the tomb of a loved one, you just don't forget that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That wouldn't have been a mistake. And then the fourth one is that all the disciples hallucinated, that they saw a vision. They saw what they wanted to see. And that this hallucination made them believe that the tomb was empty. And of course, circling back to the right explanation for the empty tomb, we would say Jesus raised from the dead, as he had prophesied that he would by the power of God, and he lives today.
Yeah. So the last E that we have is kind of going back to this idea of eyewitness. I mentioned it earlier, but it's worth kind of talking about in more detail. And so really just the sheer number of eyewitnesses should be influential as we kind of judge the veracity of Jesus' resurrection. The fact that Jesus appeared not just to the disciples, but large crowds, up to 500 at one time. And so if it's unlikely to think that all 12 disciples experienced some sort of hallucination, it's even more unlikely that up to 500 people would experience that same hallucination as well and be testifying to the fact that Jesus is alive. Now, some would maybe argue that maybe this is all some sort of concocted story, conspiracy started by Jesus's followers that kind of spread, all those sort of things. And when we think about that accusation, I want to think about maybe some of the eyewitnesses that early Christianity, records in the Gospels, and why we would choose these eyewitnesses if we were making it up. You may know from the stories of the Gospels that some of the first people to encounter the risen Lord and to see the empty tomb were women. And in that society, in that time, women's testimony was not deemed credible. So I find it interesting that if we are making this story up, that we would choose sources that already would be called into question the fact that, we're relying on the eyewitness testimony of a number of women to Jesus' resurrection. And to me, the only reason to rely so heavily upon that sort of eyewitness that would have been judged at that time is because it's true. They really were the first ones to see Jesus and to see this empty tomb in that way. I think also, too, it's interesting to look at Jesus's family, particularly his immediate family. I think of his brother James, who we read in the book of Acts became a very influential leader in the early church. But it's worth realizing and remembering that when Jesus was alive, before he had been crucified, he was rejected by his entire family, including his brother James. I mean, really, the only person that believed in Jesus as the Messiah was his mother. And it's even, kind of curious to think what sort of belief she had at the time of what this all meant prior to the resurrection. And so James totally and completely rejected Jesus, but yet after his crucifixion, something brought James to faith. And so what we believe brought James to faith was his encounter with the risen Lord, as we hear that mentioned in the book of Acts. And so there's this radical transformation that takes place in the life of James, that takes place in the life of the disciples. They go from being extremely fearful and cowering and hiding from Roman government to now standing before some of the most powerful people in the Roman government, claiming that Jesus indeed is the only way to be reconciled to God. And so these eyewitness testimonies are vast in their sheer number, but also compelling in some of the transformation that we see in the lives of those who encounter the risen Lord.
Amen. So there you have it. 4 lines of evidence, 4 talking points as we think about how could we believe in the resurrection? The execution of Jesus, the early evidence, the empty tomb, the eyewitnesses. All of these are ways of thinking it through and realizing the resurrection really is plausible and true, that we can believe it. So, of course, we want to leave you with a word of encouragement and hope. And this just naturally encourages us, right? To think about the resurrection, Christ's resurrection, the hope of our own resurrection in a world with a global pandemic, people dying. Just that reminder and that hope is really helpful. And even beyond that, just to think about tough questions have good answers, especially as you go to Scripture. And we really want to encourage you with that. And that's part of the thinking behind the Thinking Biblically Conference, is that we want to encourage people to ask the toughest questions and not be afraid, to know that there are good answers that are out there. Awesome.
Yeah, and so this is something that we do pretty regularly in our youth ministry with our junior and senior high students. Periodically throughout the year, we maybe have 4 nights throughout the year that we dedicate strictly to just this idea of question and answer, where we allow students to ask questions of whatever they want. And myself and some leaders, we seek to give good biblical answers. And sometimes those answers are better than others. But it is consistently one of the favorite kind of recurring activities that we do with our students. And a lot of times we get students asking, when can we do another Q&A night? And so one thing that I would like to encourage, you as viewers, if you have students, junior high, middle school, I think even kids, I would encourage you to tune in to Thinking Biblically, because we are going to have opportunity not just for our speaker to give presentations on some of these apologetic topics, but to do some free-form Q&A where you as viewers can tune in and send in your questions, and those questions will be answered live via our stream with some of our pastors, as well as our speaker, Nathan Betts, with Ravi Zacharias International Ministry. And so that's going to be really fun. Students, please join into that. You're going to probably be the most familiar with this format since you've done it before this way. And so we're really excited about that opportunity to ask some of these questions and hopefully to get some really good answers, better answers than I could probably give, since, Nathan is in many ways an expert in this field.
Yeah, so ask your questions. Seek the truth, even if you want to start asking them before the conference. But be thinking about those. We encourage you to tune in, thinking biblically. Encourage you to invite people digitally to join in. And of course, don't forget to join us every Sunday morning at 10:30 for our live worship service. We're so glad so many of you have been tuning into that and sharing that with friends and family from all over the place. So with that, we'll see you next time.